I know some of you, and have met a few of you today. My name is Dula, and I'll be doing talk today. And I'll go ahead and get started, and I will project loudly because I don't wear a microphone, but it's being recorded. If anybody finds this talk interesting and or useful, they can please feel free to share it with anybody or any of the materials in it. My slides are text heavy. I don't get complaints about my slides. I think my slides should be able to stand alone, that if I send them to you and you see a series of bullets, those bullets should be substantiated with actual information. So I won't be reading them, but you can as I go through it to further indulge in your interests. The obligatory disclosure slide, I don't have any financial conflicts whatsoever. I'm not getting paid to do this. I'm not getting paid to do my research. I'm not getting paid to do anything but teach. So happy in my life, happy in my work, and in no danger of being called to question about my ethics, I hope. Christy Adams, Francis Chumley, Scott Geller, Ben Martin, and Michael Meisner, as well as Kyle Sir, all helped me co-author several manuscripts, the vast majority of which are represented here, where I just extracted things from manuscripts that were relevant, reworded them here or there. But if you would like any of those documents, just email me at dulac@etsu.edu, and I'll be happy to send you, PDF copies for free. So there's references at the end of this presentation. They're extensive, but there's far more in those documents, and there's stuff that you might link out to from those documents. So the presenting purpose I have today is to help people realize what is the relevance, really, of dangerous driving to clinical settings. And as a clinical psychologist, that's kind of a weird thing for people in my field. When I say I'm clinical and my research is dangerous driving, they're like, how is that clinical? And by the time I finish this presentation, I hope you will say, how is it not clinical? In what way could it not be considered clinical? And so understanding the relevance of dangerous driving to clinical settings, identifying three main types or subtypes of dangerous driving, as well as various risk factors, explaining the role of individual and environmental risk factors in assessment, and then identifying some steps to appropriately intervene to help mitigate risk when possible. The whole idea here is to prevent crashes from occurring. We have a whole infrastructure in place legally to help police possible risks, but oftentimes the police show up after it's too late when a crash has already occurred. So if we start thinking of ourselves all involved in traffic safety, that takes a little bit of the burden off of law enforcement and helps possibly prevent some of the terrible tragedies that we'll see occur. Because that's what we have here. We have a national tragedy. We've had it for a very long time. It's better than it used to be, but it's not anywhere near where it needs to be. An acceptable level of risk for driving vehicles, I don't know what that would be, but it's a lot lower than what we see. If we go back to looking at ages 11 to 27 in 2013, we're looking at 32,000 deaths, which is about 3/4 of all the deaths. So it's the leading cause of death, right? And a significant cause of injury, because you had 2 million injuries as a result in that age group that we know of, right? That were reported, that were collated, that were archived in data sets that are available to researchers, primarily NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So if you look at 2002 to 2010, just this 8-year period, looking at 325,000 people killed, which is a stunning number when you consider what we've gone to, the lengths we've gone to protect our country after, say, 9/11, when we lost a few thousand people terribly and tragically. We revolutionized our culture. And yet, in the course of an 8-year period, we have well over 250,000 people killed and millions upon millions injured, and people just say, well, that's driving. And that kind of rationale is the thing we're up against. Changing people's mindsets is very difficult because driving being a very common activity, most people just kind of accept the levels of risk as just part of the game. But we don't call them accidents in our field. We call them crashes. Accidents implies a mishap, something that couldn't have been prevented. That's what lay people use to describe crashes, and that's understandable, right? You'd like to think that it couldn't have been prevented. But with most crashes, human behavior was a major contributing cause. Even in the case of environmental issues, say a tree branch falling out, or a dog, or in the case of Johnson City currently, a black bear running into the road, right? Reaction is human behavior. Very, very rarely does a wheel just fly off of a car and cause a crash. And even at that level, we might look back into the factory and talk about human behavior and inspection in the process of ensuring safety. So we're really talking about human behavior, and we're talking about people being killed and injured, and that's clinical, right, by definition. This is a chart from some time ago, 1997 actually, looking at the period of 90 to 97. It was published in 04, but Dr. Bruce Behringer gave me this some time ago. And so the numbers are dated, but I think it's also interesting to note that where we live in the Appalachian region, there are health disparities of many types. And if you look at those, you see that premature mortality of those 35 to 64, those over 65, and white male, white female, black female categories, heart disease, 27.4%, lung cancer, 27%, motor vehicle crashes, 25%. And it's about the same for white females, except that they have a much lower incidence here in lung cancer than males. But then you look over in heart disease, 9 for black males, 4.2, and then almost threefold increase there. And then same thing here. You have a big increase for motor vehicle crashes. And so who shows up in our emergency rooms? Who does the helicopter go to get from Johnson City Medical Center very often? It's usually people who are in remote rural regions who have been involved in crashes and need help, need extraction, and have a long way to go before they get adequate medical care to possibly save their life or mitigate further damage. So from my standpoint, the only way it's going to change is if we make traffic safety a core value for the country. In the same way that we make national security a priority, rightfully so, right? If people die and that can be prevented, then we should have a priority suggest itself pretty readily. We do have a National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. We do have apparatus designed for that. But when you look at, say, its budget compared to the defense budget, there's no comparison. It's a drop in the bucket. So what we fund indicates our priorities, and what is indicated to me is that this is just part of life. It's not a priority. We have made some tremendous headway in lowering deaths and injuries, largely through the increase of engineering. So the use of airbags, for example. And those are great. That's wonderful. That's as it should be. We had a tremendous increase in the use of safety belts. It's still not at 100%, and there's demographic differences depending on what kind of car you drive, whether you live in rural or urban regions. But the fact is we've kind of plateaued again. And we're looking at roughly 35,000, 40,000 people killed every year and many millions injured as like a baseline. It's like just what we've gotten it down to, and I'm not satisfied with that. So discussion should be a regular topic of interpersonal communication amongst everybody. If it was a core cultural value, it would be. The fact that it isn't indicates that it's not yet a core cultural value. But I think there's no reason it couldn't be part of our communications in clinical settings. That is the place that we as healthcare professionals interact with patients who drive all day, every day. We have an opportunity to connect with people in a setting that actually is set up and designed to promote their health and safety. And oftentimes will not ever venture into the territory of whether or not they're safe drivers or whether or not they possess any additional risk factors for greater danger behind the wheel. Now, I and my colleague Dr. Geller, a long time ago, 11 years ago, suggested we get rid of the word road rage. Road rage in the literature doesn't really tell us anything. It's a very provocative term coined by the media. When I first started studying aggressive driving in the year 1999, there were about 30 empirical studies in the literature that covered it. And then by the time I got toward the end of my doctorate and had done a prelim, there was a doubling of that, maybe a tripling of that. And what I found was a tremendous confusion in the literature, that each study used its own operational definitions for any terms that it decided to use because there was no consensus about what terminology was appropriate. And so for some person, road rage is getting really angry, while in a car, but not aggressing outwardly at somebody else. For another person, it's actually causing physical violence to somebody. But you don't have to go to that kind of terminology to get at the heart of what's happening. And so we suggested that there's actually one type of meta category. It's called dangerous driving. Right? Aggressive driving means something different to everybody in this room probably. And that's what you would expect it to be. Is aggressive driving actually causing harm to somebody or attempting to cause harm to somebody? Or is it weaving in and out of traffic? Is it running stoplights? Is it speeding? And that's the problem we had in the literature, is it was everything to everybody depending on who they were and what they wanted to advance in terms of their own data sets. So we said aggressive driving must conform to historical definitions of aggression in animal and human literature, and that is to say that there should be some intent to harm. Doesn't mean that harm has to have been inflicted, but there should be some intention. And of course, as you well know, intention is hard to assess in a car over there. But if you can't assume any intention, then you can't assume any aggression, because aggression is a willful act towards somebody else, and you could harm them physically and or psychologically. We do that all the time when we scream at people, when we call them names, and when we use fanciful hand gestures. Right? We are making them hurt psychologically, or hoping that they will hurt psychologically as a result of our behavior, and thus it is interpersonal aggression. So could be verbal, could be gestural, could be physical, but it has to be something that was intentional, or it's not aggression, right? Which then takes us to another category of negative cognitive emotional driving. I used to just say negative emotional, but then cognitive emotional is really where we're at with that, because you don't have an emotion without accompanying cognitions, and oftentimes cognitions may drive emotional experiences. And it turns out that a lot of people get pissed off when they drive. Probably almost everybody does. But that doesn't make them aggressive. Most people don't actually aggress when they're angry. They just stew in their anger, right? They ruminate on their anger. They use up cognitive resources being angry that would be better spent on more safe orientation, like paying attention to the road, letting it go. But that's not the only kind of negative emotion you could have. Sadness, frustration, dejection, jealousy, any powerful emotional experience is going to get you into a state of ruminative, looping and take your attention away from the road. So we can look at that as a negative experience that is contributing to dangerousness. Risky driving then would be risk-taking behaviors. So now we get to separating out aggressive driving from being everything, and you can well see how you might speed or run a red light or weave in and out of traffic or drive under the influence or be distracted while driving and never intend to harm anybody. Right? So it's not aggressive. And you're not even upset. You might even be happy. Right? You could be drunk and quite gleeful. So it's not negative cognitive emotions that we're talking about. It's risk-taking behavior, right? You're putting yourself at risk of harming yourself or others. And so with those three subcategories defined, you can see that any of them can break down into further subcategories. And if you wanted to say, well, what is road rage? Well, okay, you could say it is all of these. It's a combination, right? You got somebody who's really angry, who's engaging in risk-taking, maybe riding up on somebody's bumper, for example, and they are intending to cause harm psychologically or physically, right? But we all know in psychiatry, I'm sure in psychology, that there are some people that might take quite a bit of pleasure in intimidating other people, right? And so that they're actually not upset. They're just aggressive. There are not many of them, but they exist. And so you can see that these categories are important distinctions. So now, if we look at risk factors, environmental factors are ones that I'm not particularly concerned with, but do absolutely affect any driving experience. That'd be weather condition, vehicle condition, whether it's daytime, nighttime, those kinds of things. Road condition, whether it's in disrepair, curves, incline, traffic conditions, and then perceived behavior of other drivers. So other drivers are in the environment. And we make a lot of inferences about the intentions of other drivers, but probably there are no circumstances in which it is harder actually to draw inferences about intention. When you see somebody cut you off, did they intend to cut you off, or did they mistakenly cut you off? How could you possibly know when you're in a vehicle and the other person is several yards away from you in another vehicle. So looking at perceived behavior, we'll see that plays heavily into how people interact with one another on the road. So it's also a social behavior. Most people don't think about that, but driving is inherently a social behavior. It's just one in which your social unit is quite isolated from the next social unit, but all must cooperate and integrate to provide safe passage for one another. So just looking at the aggressive side of things, this is a very simplified model that my colleagues and I came up with just to kind of get a handle on mapping it out. And I'm not exclusively interested in aggressive driving by any stretch. When I first came here and we were interviewing new candidates, people would come and go, oh, they tell me you're the road rage guy. And I'm like, God, I hope they don't tell you that. All right, I'm not the road rage guy. I'm a guy interested in traffic safety in the broadest possible definitions, right? The most provocative and interesting of which to most people is aggression. So looking at that, it's important to understand what goes into it, and a lot goes into it. So you got your situational, environmental variables right here, driving conditions, whatever might be going on. The state of mind of the driver, relaxed, agitated, sleepy, angry, whatever it might be. Then either a real event happens or a perceived event happens, right? That you think somebody did something is enough to cause you to react in some way. And that event might have a high level of perceived severity or a low level of perceived severity. It may be perceived as intentional or it may be perceived as unintentional, but the higher that you perceive the level of severity, the more likely you are to have high levels of arousal, right? So when I ride next to an 18-wheeler, doesn't bother me at all. I could do it all day. And yes, I know the wheel could blow out and all of that. Yes, the probability is that it won't, even if I ride next to it all day. But for my wife, she's not comfortable with that, right? So she's in a state of apprehension if we're riding right next to an 18-wheeler. Now, if you're the driver and you're in a state of apprehension, I hope everybody here is familiar with psychiatry. The more aroused you are, right, the more upset you are, the less likely you are to be objective in processing cognitive information, right? You're going to be more likely to seize on stereotypes, biases, and heuristics to generate explanations for what's happening, and that schema-driven perception is then going to be more than likely the basis of your behavioral responses. And so that's what we're getting at right here. Not that this is any kind of mathematical algorithm. It's just a general sense of, well, if you have a high level of severity and you have somebody that is particularly aroused, their cognitive processing is going to probably be biased. Somebody else might be in the exact same situation but not experience the same level of arousal and might think about or appraise the situation very differently. At the same time, some people are inclined more towards biased cognitive processing simply because they're human beings and have not been in social psychology classes, right? And as I like to say it, because people are like, well, psychologists, they should be, they shouldn't be biased. And I say, well, physicians know all about bacteria and viruses, but that does not make them immune to bacteria and viruses. Social psychologists know all about biases, but they're biased too because they're people. We just study them. It doesn't make us immune to them. Hopefully, people who are educated in these ideas will be a little bit more likely to question their assumptions and evaluate possible actions more thoroughly, but generally speaking, they won't. And so if you've got a high level of severity, highly biased cognitive process, and then you get into personality traits potentially, right? Are you somebody that's predisposed towards hostile attribution bias, or high levels of trait anger, or high levels of trait aggression? In that case, now you've got the perfect recipe for major retaliation, even if it was a perceived event, right? You cut me off. I'm highly offended by that. I'm biased. I'm using the fundamental attribution era. You don't care. You're a big jerk. I'm going to teach you a lesson, and I'm predisposed towards that kind of thing anyway, so I have all the justification I need. Possibly violence is reached, but you could have anything else besides violence. And then, of course, the bottom line is, you could go the other route as well, the low processing route or the low severity route, low trait aggression route, those kinds of things. But I think when you move into negative cognitive emotions in general, you really get back into what's at the heart of psychology and psychiatry clinically, right, is starting to really understand how people think and how they feel and how what they think and what they feel drives what they do. No pun intended, drives. That was good. Anyway, most drivers get angry. I mean, that's documented. One study found drivers felt anger on about 10% of their trips and frustrated on about 30%. So there's that. You start getting those research distinctions between frustration, right, and anger. And we've long since done away with the frustration, anger, or the frustration aggression hypothesis by Dollard, et cetera. But it's still there. I mean, heightened frustration under the right circumstances with people who are higher in trait aggression and things of that nature is more likely to lead to aggressive outcomes. But here, again, we don't actually have to get to aggression to be in a state of dangerousness. So most people simply stew. They get into a situation that they feel has been a wrong done to them at the very least, or a danger imposed upon them by somebody else, and they feel angry and upset or frustrated. And that state of mind, in and of itself, detracts again from your cognitive resources to attend to the road safely, right? And so whether you aggress or not, you're now in a heightened state of cognitive agitation, emotional agitation, and that's going to take you away from the things that make you a safe driver. But it didn't have to be just this. One scholar back in 2004, Rosenblatt, said that he was talking about grieving while driving. I mean, think about how many clinicians interact with patients who had just lost somebody very close to them, right? Who drove to the appointment in utter mental lockdown mode on what's just happened, what they've just lost. Everything that they care about is consuming them, and they're at the wheel. And so that hasn't been tested as a hypothesis, but the hypothesis is that, grieving while driving may be very dangerous, right? Because you need to have your mind focused on the road, and if you are in a grieving process, an intense grieving process, one can see how that would detract from your ability to pay attention to the road. I did some work with Christy and Michael and Robin Leonard back in 2010, just looking at a college population using the Beck Anxiety Inventory. And what we found, and nobody had really looked at this before, is anxiety is related to dangerous driving. And I don't think any of us see anxiety in our practices, right? That's pretty common, very common, actually. And so, notwithstanding prescribing medications that might also interfere with driving, just the experience of anxiety apparently, and this is a correlational study, obviously not experimental group, but looking at high versus low and medium levels of anxiety, tripartite split, we found that the high anxiety group had caused significantly more crashes and engaged in more DUI episodes than the lower or medium anxiety groups, right? And that was the question was specifically, because we break it down on the it's self-report. Obviously, there are a lot of limitations with that. But you have how many crashes have you been involved in? How many crashes have you caused, right? And so these are people admitting to causing the crashes, admitting to DUI episodes, and people with high levels of anxiety admit to more of these. So that's something I think is tremendously relevant clinically. Other cognitive emotional risk factors go really into some of the social psychology literature with hostile attribution bias, rumination tendencies. Some people are high ruminators, low dissipators. Some people are high dissipators, low ruminators. They let things go pretty easily, pretty quickly, and obviously that is advantageous if you're in traffic or a traffic jam because there's lots of opportunities to get really angry in a traffic jam. I just went up into Maryland the other day and drove the DC Beltway and came to a complete stop at a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit 5 times, right? On the highway, I stopped, and I'm okay with that now. Used to, that really would bother me, but now it's okay, right? But rumination, it's all about whether or not you're able to process things in an unbiased fashion, and even if you're being very objective and perceiving that something may have been done to you unjustly, that you can let it go, because holding on to it actually doesn't solve the problem. It only adds to it. Stereotypes about drivers, women drivers are actually better drivers than men. I think that's, if you know anything about actuarial tables and how insurance is charged, women don't actually have the higher premiums. that should tell you everything you know about the stereotypes. Nonetheless, people hold stereotypes in the face of contradictory evidence. And so whatever that is, whether it's racial or whether it's socioeconomic based on the car somebody's driving, class distinctions, male, female, what's on bumper stickers, for example, because you may not actually be driving this car that you put the bumper stickers on, right? So all of those things play into that. Unchecked fundamental attribution error, actor-observer cognitive biases, whether you're overworked, overstressed, relationship problems, family problems, all of these things are person factors that come into play when you're in the driving realm. So moving into risky driving per se, where you can just explode the number of categories of things you can focus on. And I think this is such a hard thing to wrap our heads around that it's really one of the reasons why so little attention gets paid to it, generally speaking. There are certainly niche groups that devote a lot of time and a lot of resources, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, for example, for one type of dangerous driving. Right? We've got NHTSA, which administers money to lots of states for lots of different interventions. But there's so many things to intervene on that it's frankly overwhelming, I think, to most people to start to consider it. And most people haven't considered it beyond driver education class, or if you're lucky enough to go to the class to get rid of tickets, points from tickets. I've been to several of those. And those are really fun because this is my thing. I stopped dangerous driving, actually. I gave it up. I was never aggressive in the last 10 or 15 years, but I'm pretty good. You know, I'm a very good driver. You know, I go very fast and I can maneuver very quickly. And eventually, I just gave that up. I had gotten 3 tickets after a long drought of no tickets. And I said to myself, well, gosh, that should be telling me something. Am I really living up to my aspirations as a researcher and a clinician? I devote my life and my time to studying safety. And here I hold out myself as an exception to the rule, as exceptionally good. And I've been to those classes. I actually got to co-teach one while I was in it because one of the cops actually was a former student of mine. And he's like, you do this, don't you? I'm like, I do. And I like going to see what they're teaching, whether it's research-based or whether it's not research-based. And we talked about validity and reliability of the measure they were using to assess people for the purposes of collecting data to see whether the state was having any effect on people whatsoever. And that was great fun for me, but then I decided I should stop doing that. And I thought about the money and the points, and the points were gone from the classes. And the money, I really figured if I had looked at the entire period that I went without getting caught and all the tickets I had amassed in that, it would have cost me about an average of $7 a month. And I thought to myself, you know, if they issued permits to people to drive however they want, I would have paid $20 a month for that privilege. So it really wasn't about penalties for me. So what effectively changes people's minds, right? What effectively makes the difference to somebody about whether they personally see themselves as responsible? For me, it was cognitive dissonance, really. I mean, I'm doing all this work and have been for some time, and I'm not living up to my own aspirations. And now I drive really slow. I won't go more than 5 miles an hour over the speed limit. And my son says I'm actually worse now, but I'm not a good driver because I'm bored. So I have no arousal. I'm driving along at 55. And then we stop on the Beltway, and I'm okay with it now. It's okay. But that gets into the risk-taking behaviors, right? I'm a high risk taker. I'm high venturesomeness, high impulsivity to some degree, but not so much now as a 45-year-old adult. That kind of thing burns out over time if you survive. I survived. I got lucky. But then you look at things like substance use, substance abuse. That's a personal factor that we deal with in clinical settings all the time, right? And way back in the day, I had that problem. Sleepiness. That's something everybody in here probably deals with on a regular basis. I remember when I was in graduate school, there was a period that I had not slept for 72 hours. I had a wife, 2 kids, 30 hours of work a week, and a full-time load of graduate classes. I wasn't manic, not hypomanic, because I don't get hypomanic or manic, and I don't do cocaine, never have. So it was just caffeine, which I was tolerant to, and I started having micro sleeps, right? Where you just, that moment where you just kind of, you knock out, and you're not in control of that, right? I've had that happen to me 2 times on the road, because you get to that point where you're thinking, I can make it, I can make it, I can do this, I can pull it through, I can stop at the next exit if I want to, I got to the next exit, I can make to the next one, and then you go unconscious. And whether it's for half a second or 5 seconds, you don't know unless it's too late. And that happened to me once, and I was about, I think, early 20s when that happened, where I went out, and it was at night, and I opened my eyes, and I had drifted onto the shoulder where they didn't have rumble strips yet, right, back in those days. And ahead of me in about 200 yards was a car that was stopped on the side of the road. And it just occurred to me that I would have killed them. If that had happened a few seconds later than it did, I would have killed them, and maybe myself. And at that point, I pledged to stop whenever I knew that I was getting into that state of mind, and I do now. I drive a lot at my discretion. I'll stop at rest areas and gas stations and take 15 to 20-minute naps and get back on the road without worrying about what my destination time will be, because I'd rather arrive alive than arrive on time. And that's the key here, is like we got to realize that if us in this room push ourselves so hard that we get into states of sleep deprivation, and we clinically know this about ourselves, what about the average layperson who has no idea what a microsleep is, or has no idea what circadian rhythms are, or things of that nature, or what their maybe own limits are? So you get into typical safety belt use, child restraints. Has anybody ever asked about that with their patients? So do you wear your seatbelt? Do you do that consistently? Don't you? Do you actually, 90% of child safety seats are installed incorrectly. Now, most of those are minor errors, but every error contributes to greater risk. So everybody you ask thinks they're in the 10% that does it right. Right? So how do they know? How would we know without checking? Invulnerability, overconfidence, usually in the young and the manic. Age-related declines. In Tennessee, I got some data that showed that it was a tremendous increase in T-bone crashes from the side. And we started looking at working on a grant, which never came to fruition, because I don't think that you necessarily have to stop driving when you get much older, but you do have to make some serious realizations that maybe your neck's a little stiffer. And maybe what you need to do is actually overcorrect and train yourself to look right angle this way, right angle that way, because that's what you see is people were simply neglecting oncoming vehicles that were clear to see if you had actually checked. That's how close they were, that as soon as you pulled out, you got nailed. And you missed that. But I don't think that's because you're old. I think that's because you have a lifetime of pulling out and it's been okay, and you probably have got some kind of arthritic conditions or other kind of conditions that make you less inclined to make full turns. But you could probably intervene on that pretty easily. Venturesomeness, impulsivity, distracted driving, and that's what I think you wanted to focus on to some degree. And I appreciate the invitation from Dr. Goodkin to be here today. Cell phones, distracted driving. So distracted driving is not just cell phones. Distracted driving is anything that distracts you from driving, which is a lot of stuff, frankly. They thought that maybe it killed 3,000 people and injured 420,000 in 2012. But how can you know that? How could you possibly know that? So this would be an incredibly conservative estimate. And if you look at other estimates, then you get a range of 25% to maybe 80% of motor vehicle crashes. Because if you think about it, what's your odds of crashing when you're DUI, when you're driving under the influence? They're actually not that high, right? In reality, you're not likely to crash the car when you have a .10 BAC. What you're likely to do is drive home. But if you do crash, it's entirely your fault because you introduced an element into your own system that slowed your reaction time, right? So you have responsibility for it. Thus, we implement major penalties to try to prevent people from doing that because people don't naturally see the consequence of that action. The natural consequences most often is that you get home after a great night and you don't have to leave your car overnight, you don't have to wait around for friends to take you home, and you don't have to pay for a cab. The consequences are overwhelmingly positive. So what do? You create major disincentives through the legal process to make people aware that they are engaging in what seems like a simple thing, but is really a very dangerous thing. Way more dangerous than just driving. But when you start looking then at what causes crashes, it's not just that somebody fell asleep at the wheel or that somebody's mind-numbingly under the influence of some substance. It can be a fraction of a second, look to the side, or looking down, or looking up, or looking at a phone, or looking at a billboard, or arguing with a passenger, or changing the music on the stereo, or lighting a cigarette, or having a bite of something to eat, or looking in the mirror to check your appearance, or looking at the map or the GPS, any of that at the wrong moment can kill you or other people. And that's the hardest thing to convey to people, because driving is such a frequent activity for most people that it kind of goes on base brain, automated, conditioned, right? You just do it. I mean, I'm sure everybody in here has had the experience of driving somewhere and not really remembering that you drove there, because you were thinking about other things, engaged in conversations, daydreaming, whatever it was. You know, you're on automatic pilot, and driving's getting done, and your higher consciousness is drifting off to something else. So if it drifts off sufficiently, it may not orient back, because if you are oriented at the road and you're thinking about something else, and something darts across or a vehicle comes into your path, you'll immediately come back to present awareness and quickly respond. But if you're not able to see it in time, you won't be able to respond. So any activity, and that's, you know, like I said, a variety of things outside, inside the vehicle. But of course it includes cellular phone use, which is near ubiquitous now, right? I have one in my pocket. I was consulting it right before y'all walked in. After everybody leaves, I might take a picture of the room again and post it on Facebook. Compulsive use of cell phone technology. It's so convenient to have a computer in your pocket. And CDC looks at just breaking down what's the risk. Well, you've got visual distraction, manual distraction, and cognitive distraction, all three of which can happen while you're using a cellular phone. Now, lots of things contribute to whether you will or you won't use a phone. My son is a Luddite. He's 18, and he just got off a flip phone. He just never wanted anything but a flip phone, but they don't really make them anymore. It was easier for me to get him on my plan with a smartphone, which he had no interest in having, right? And other people, for age factors, personal reason, socioeconomic factors that may or may not have the latest gadget, or may or may not be inclined to use them regularly or habitually or even hardly at all sometimes. But taking that as granted, talking on the phone is not the only problem. We now have texting as a problem, and old people like me text now. When I first started texting, I thought it was a ludicrous thing, right? Texting. Well, back in my day, when I first got a cell phone, I think it was in the year 2002, right? I was like, I don't want one of those. And then I got one because my wife at the time had got one, you might as well get two. And I had it, and I went to the store, and I forgot what I was supposed to get, and I went, wait a minute. I could call and ask, right? Not even put a quarter in a machine anymore, right? And very soon I was hooked on the cell phone. And very quickly after I learned to text, it became very reinforcing to text, right? Somebody wants you. Somebody wants to say something to you. Somebody out there needs to get your attention, and you want to find out who it is. And I found myself in my vehicle. This was, I guess, 2010-ish, 9-ish, somewhere in there, like pulling out my phone and looking at it and responding. And my son, who's smarter than me, he's like, what the hell are you doing? I'm like, well, I'm just texting. I can drive and text at the same time, right? I can't I? It's so seductive. It seems so simple. I'm looking. Hey, I can just push the button and talk. It seems so simple, and it's so reinforcing that it just seduces you into doing it seemingly without realizing how dangerous it is. But now we got apps and videos and internet surfing and GPS and all that stuff. And you look back, and they knew 2 decades ago that using phones in cars was bad, right? That's how long the lag time is between research, right, and application, before laws are made that recognize what bench researchers with simulators knew a long time ago, is it's a bad idea to divide your attention while you're doing something that could kill you. And that's been shown with handheld. It's been shown with hands-free. Lately, we've seen that hands-free and integrated hand phones pose less of a risk than handheld, but all of them elevate the risk. Doesn't matter how you use the phone, because it's not that you're using a phone per se. It's not that just touching the phone is the problem. It's really that the conversation is the problem. And you say, well, I have conversations with passengers all the time, but they're in your car. It's another set of eyes watching the road. You could drift off or talk to them, and they go, oh my God! And you react to them. And that's not the case with cell phone communication. Nobody who's talking to you has access to your visual field, so they can't provide additional input to correct for your conversational distraction. And in that sense, people seem to know that you shouldn't do this, as we'll see in a minute, but the risk is equivalent to DUI. And maybe greater than DUI, which they don't actually want to say, because they spend a lot of time and money telling people, don't DUI, and then something that seems less dangerous is more dangerous. Won't that water down the message about DUI? All right, so there's some PR problems that we're running into as we look at the research. If people think this isn't dangerous and it's more dangerous than DUI, then all the time we're spending saying buzz driving is drunk driving, because people go, well, I'm not drunk, I'm just buzzed. I mean, that's where that campaign came from, right? People just didn't define themselves as drunk. They perceived themselves as just buzzed. Not a problem, right? Yes, it is a problem. We better initiate a campaign. So now we try to figure out what kind of campaign do we need to do, and who's doing this? One study in 2013 said 660,000 at any given time in the U.S. during the daytime. Another observational study found 8%, which is substantially higher. I mean, if you think about 10%, 1 out of any 10 cars that you see, I think those are probably conservative estimates, right? If you think at a minimum, 1 out of any 10 cars that you encounter, the driver is engaged in some kind of phone-based behavior. That's your risk that you're facing when you go out driving in a defensive driving manner, right? That's what you're up against. But if you are that person, right, and that's just at any given time, because it turns out that these people are not redundant, they're additive. We look at, definitely the research suggests that it's more dangerous. So you look at this, the general public, 88% of people say, yeah, it's probably dangerous. It's not a knowledge problem, right? It's a behavior problem. That's what makes it clinical. It's not just that people know that it's dangerous. They seem to know it's dangerous. And in the same study, 30% go, oh yeah, well I do it. I do it anyway. Well, I looked at undergraduates here at ETSU. 81% admitted to doing it in the past 2 weeks. It's a lot of people, right? So at any given time it might be 1 in 10, but of the number of drivers, it's way higher than 10%. We don't know actually how high it is, but it could be as high as 80% of people find this behavior something they can't resist doing, even though they know it's dangerous, which sounds like a lot of the other risk-taking that we see in clinical settings, right? I mean, what's the difference between knowing that drinking too much is bad for you, knowing that doing crack is bad for you, but not being able to resist doing it, right? That's a clinical problem. Let's look here. Cell phone laws have been enacted. So people have tried to make these distinctions. Early on they were like, well, only handheld models. Now most of them have text laws. Most states have laws that ban cell phone uses in terms of conversations and texts. You're supposed to pull over if you want to talk on the phone or text anybody. However, most of them don't ban using GPS. In other words, they don't ban other functions that your phone can do. So you get down to the point of how does an officer know whether you're engaging in texting or whether you're engaging in looking up your destination on your GPS app. So you can see right away you run into some problems with enforcement, because unless you have clear indication that a person is using a phone illegally, you don't have cause to pull them over. Now, very few efficacy studies actually exist, and one of the early ones said, hey, this is working. It cut it in half, but if you look at that, that's 2003. That's like ancient in terms of cell phones, right? I mean, that's 12 years ago. Think about how far technology has come and how much more that behavior is infused into the society than it was back then, right? And that was in a relatively concentrated area in New York. North Carolina law in 2009, they looked at it and said, it doesn't look like it has any effect at all. Your law doesn't work. It makes you feel good. It makes you feel like you're doing something. It makes you feel like you're responding to clear problems that everybody acknowledges exists, but it doesn't actually affect behavior. And if you look at New Jersey, for example, they strengthened their texting while driving law, but that merely made a first offense $200, third offense was $600, and only a fourth offense would get you a 3-point license penalty. Now you compare that to what happens with DUI, right? Which are, whether that's severe enough, some people would argue. But with most DUIs, you're going to get automatic arrest, right? Breathalyzer test. You're going to lose probably some of your driving privileges. Even if you plead down, you might get reckless driving. You're going to get points on your license, right? You're going to be in the paper, right, or online now, right? You're going to have people know this about you. There are probably going to be legal costs. Even if you get off, you're going to have to engage a lawyer. You're going to have to go to court. And if you're convicted, you're going to lose your privileges. And if you're convicted again, man, in some states it's the third time, you're going to jail, right? And that's safer than texting. All right, that's the difference in the approaches that we're taking. I'm not saying that a legal approach is the right approach. I'm just saying that as a society, we don't have a very good handle on how to handle risks on the road from a legal point of view. We're not consistent. And I'm hopeful that physicians and other providers will start to address the problem in clinical settings. So if you're a clinician, what are some of the things you might look at for potential risk for dangerous driving? ADHD, age, early and advanced, inexperienced and people with cognitive decline or maybe even neck joint decline with advanced age, anxiety, chronic sleep deprivation, cognitive impairments, depression, suicidality, eyesight, frequency, how often you travel, habitual use of cell phones and electronic devices. How many people have been in a session with somebody and the patient pulled out a cell phone? I mean, that should be like a clinical indicator, right? Shouldn't that be part of the mental status exam, right? Patient compulsively pulls out cell phone, right? So what do they do in the car? If they're sitting there with you in an official capacity, right, how much more likely are they to pull it out while they're driving? Probably more so. So there's a behavioral indicator. Being male is actually more risky. Ruminative tendencies, substance abuse, use or abuse, orientation to whether or not you pay attention to your vehicle maintenance, whether you use safety belts, child restraints, and the like. So there's a lot of things that are clinically relevant that you might talk to patients about. And I think that's key. And again, wrapping all of this into something we can understand is very difficult because Dr. Behringer gave me this idea as well when we were coming up with a coalition here at ETSU for traffic safety. If I just wanted to look at safety restraints, I could look at it with children, teens and young adults, middle adults, older adults as possible target populations. And then I could look at it at local levels, regional levels, or federal and multinational levels. And that's just safety restraints, right? How about driving while impaired? How about drowsy driving? How about cell phones? How about, name any distraction you want? General risk taking, running red lights, weaving in and out of traffic, etc. Roadway engineering and vehicle engineering is something we're pretty good at, actually. There are some very dangerous roadways that haven't been fixed, but most states have corps of engineers that go to accident sites, crash sites, which is, of course, too late, but that's what alerts them to potential danger, and they might rework intersections into roundabouts, or they might straighten out curves and things of that nature. And, of course, cars are going to start driving themselves, in which case we'll render most all of this moot, but till then, it's still relevant. So, what could you do to help a patient, possibly, if they were open to this idea? Start to assess their own behavior, because you aren't driving with them, I hope, right? We're not going anywhere with our patients. They're going somewhere, and they're usually taking people with them at some point or another. You can use a critical behavior checklist. Very simple, very free, only cost you Xerox money. Do we even Xerox? I guess we still Xerox. We call it Xerox, but it's really something else. Anyway, it targets safe and at-risk behaviors. Geller came up with this in an industrial organizational psychological orientation when working in all kinds of factory settings, mining settings, to help workers on the ground define what's at risk and what is safe in the way of behavior. Because what you oftentimes get in those situations is not unlike what you get in any traffic situation. You get people on the ground doing what they think they have to do to get what they need done. Up at the top, somebody goes, follow OSHA safety regulations. But then the regulations are just these lofty ideals that you have, And middle management says, we got quotas. And your boss says, you got meetings, right? And you got to be on time for your job, right? And so what happens at the end of the line is people do what they have to do to get done what they think needs to be done, right? They do what's reinforced and they don't do what's punished. And so to change that, you actually have to start from the ground up. It's not enough from the people at top just to say you shouldn't do that, because all the incentives pull for doing at-risk behaviors, right? The penalties really mitigate against you doing the safe behaviors, because if that was what was reinforced, that's what people would be doing, right? And so in that sense, you start looking at, well, how do I intervene as a human being? Well, I've got access to patients. I've got access to a Xerox machine. I have access to information about all these clinically relevant factors, and I never really thought about this in a clinical setting before. And that's cool, because this is an awesome opportunity. So basically, you just take this tool, and you can customize it. I mean, you can get it and put it in Microsoft Word, and you can change it and adapt it to almost anything else. It's not unlike any other cognitive behavioral homework task that you might give to somebody, right? It's a self-assessment task that very specifically lays out what it requires is basically that the driver have somebody willing to observe them. And you can put in this stuff or not put it in. The date's nice and helpful, and time of day can be helpful, especially if you have people with eyesight problems, maybe dusk, they have more at-risk behaviors as twilight approaches. Who knows? So you can see where those kinds of variables might or might not be relevant to who you're working with. But then, did they put on their safety belt? Did they use their turn signal for left turns and right turns? Did they make a safe lane change? Did they approach intersections properly? Did they follow the yellow light? Did they slow down the yellow and follow the red light to stop? You know, passing, lane use, speed limit, following distance, and you can just tally these. Somebody watching can unobtrusively tally these, total them up, total safe over total safe plus total at risk times 100, and you get a score. There's your baseline. And if it's anything less than 100%, and if you're a human being, it'll be substantially less than 100%, right? Now you have a target. Moving towards 100%, making 100% is unrealistic. Humans don't do that. We're not automatons. We're not machines. But if you know that, hey, a typical drive for me, I'm about 70% safe, meaning I'm 30% at risk, there's a lot of room for improvement. And then working with the clinician who checks back in to see whether they did the homework, working with a family system, you might be able to intervene. You can use ubiquity statements. You know, hey, I always check in with my patients about driving safety, like we do with many things, right? I'm not offending you. There's nothing specific about you that makes me think you're particularly at risk. It's one of the many things I care about with my patients, and I check in. Do you use your safety belt, you know, et cetera? Assess a wide variety of potential clinical risk factors, probably as indicated by the list above. You wouldn't go through a list like that for anybody about driving, but if you saw anything off that list, I hope you will now think about its implications for driving and our safety as well as their safety, because they're going to drive amongst us, right? And then offer some support to help them improve safety. Use the CBC, notify family members or friends of elevated risk, and enlist their help monitoring the patient's driving behavior and adherence to safety recommendations, and then keep checking in to make sure they're still on top of their game, that they care. Or if they don't care, that could become a topic of clinical relevance. If you don't care about your safety, what does that indicate about you clinically? Right? So those kinds of things are all things to consider. There's a bunch of references. There's a bunch more references. And that's it for me. And thank you for your time. 5 minutes early. Y'all got questions, you can stay and ask them. If you don't, feel free to vacate as far as I'm concerned. Yes, sir. Tom Jack.
I'll share an anecdote and then I got a question.
Please.
The anecdote involved doing something like what was on your assessment there.
Yes.
With my son.
Yes.
When he got his driver's license at the age of 16.
Uh-huh.
And I told him he could drive himself to school.
Right.
When he was able to go for an entire week without a moving violation.
According to your checklist.
With me in the passenger.
Nice.
It took him 6 months.
Exactly. Good for you. I had a very similar thing I did with my daughter as she learned to drive. I made her drive in the neighborhood only for 20 hours. And somewhere around hour 15, she knocked out my mailbox. And I said, that's 5 more hours. And people are like, how do you know she stays in the neighborhood? I'm like, because she has a manual transmission. I can hear her barking gears all over the place. Right? So she's never had a moving vehicle crash and she was mandated to have 25 hours of experience in a relatively safe environment before she was able to go out independently.
So here's my question.
Yes, sir.
A number of states have case law that expands malpractice liability to include liability for motor vehicle accidents that your patient is in or that your patient causes.
Wow, that's profound.
In some states, that liability has even been included to make a clinician liable to a third party who's not the patient. So if your patient hits somebody else, that person can sue you.
Wow.
Now, most of those cases have involved medication effects, but the data you're presenting suggests that somebody could argue we have a clinical duty with respect to risk assessment that goes beyond simple medication effects.
I agree.
Since everyone is in theory at risk to some degree from things like distraction,
Yes.
and so forth, how would you go about having norms or something to say this person's risk is such that it really deserves explicit attention?
That's a great question. I mean, I agree that we should bear some responsibility as clinicians to do some assessments, especially when it's obviously relevant, right? At the same time, I don't know that we should be culpable or liable if a patient then goes and engages in a behavior that causes harm to themselves or others. But the only way that would happen is if there was some kind of accountability, some kind of top-down change in curriculum in medical school and doctoral programs where people were trained to make this just part of their overall health assessment, in which case you'd have to get into various types of assessment, and that gets sticky because there are no really validated types of assessment globally. There are some specific types of assessments for eyesight and other kinds of things that are well accepted, but when you get into, say, somebody's substance use, there's nothing about a clinician's job that says I have to certify them as safe to drive, knowing they have a substance abuse condition.
When there's been liability attached in the cases I'm talking about, it's not that the clinician failed to certify somebody as safe to drive. Usually the legal theory has been you failed to warn the patient and let them know they were at elevated risk.
Wow.
And so,
I mean, you could do something like a handout with this if that was the case. Duty to warn, where you said here is a laundry list of things that are very commonly experienced in our clinical settings that affect people's ability to drive safely. If you meet criteria for anything on this list, you should talk with your physician, provider, therapist about your safety as a driver. That would be one way to get it. Yes?
No doubt that my family practitioner would ask me about seatbelts, and I know that family
Good.
practice AAFP has certainly included that in assessments.
Yes.
The question I wanted to pose, though, and it's interesting that you brought this up about young drivers. In the VA, we have this question with elderly drivers all the time, the question of assessing. Usually we have middle-aged family members saying, Dad can't drive anymore.
Right.
And we get into very difficult questions about that. I wonder if you might opine on the idea of, in the state of Tennessee, or better nationally, having step-graded licensure for young drivers as well as for elderly drivers.
Yes.
At a certain level of function, for instance, no longer driving at night.
That's a fascinating question. Many states, including Tennessee, have graduated licensing laws. Some of them are more stringent than others. On the whole, graduated licensing laws do bring down death and injury rates for that age group. It doesn't necessarily keep them from being distracted drivers, and it doesn't make them any less inclined to use cell phones, is what early research inclines. But they're more skilled, more experienced, and less likely to make fatal mistakes while driving if they do the graduated approach. I guess what you look at on the other end of the spectrum is a graduated loss of abilities you're trying to assess for that may or may not be experienced by any given person. And I think that's something that could be, it's very touchy. When the family physician has to have the conversation with the middle-aged child about whether the parent should be driving anymore, that's very painful, and a lot of physicians shy away from doing it. If you've been seeing somebody as your patient for 15, 20, 30 years, and then you're the one that tells them they can't drive, so much of our identity as Americans comes from having the freedom to go where we want, when we want, and if we own a vehicle, we often feel a very strong tie to the vehicle, and so to take that privilege away seems almost like character assassination rather than just simple safety adherence. And so I think if you built that into the system, it would be easier for physicians to do their jobs. It would be easier for families to have, at some point, and that's where the arbitrariness comes in, you should probably be reviewed for a driver's license test more frequently, right? Rather than just being automatically renewed for X number of years. So, and the more advanced your age, I would think the more frequent that kind of check-in should occur, which is certainly a minor inconvenience, but if it pulls you off the road before you kill yourself or somebody else, it was well worth it. And if it's something that you can still do, you should be assessed as such and privilege continued.
Slide that talked about the 30-something to 65 age group, that's 25% or so of traffic accidents that he had above 65, where they had about 12, and then the women were actually a lot less.
Right.
Okay. So is that actually because maybe they're less elderly driving per se?
Yes. And many people will self-restrict their behavior. As they get older, many people kind of know intuitively or just behaviorally, I guess, they stop driving at night, for example. My grandfather, who lived almost 94, drove pretty well. Well, by his standards, he drove very well. By societal standards, he was a maniac. But he was no more a maniac than me, and he didn't crash his car, and he didn't do anything else until he got into his early 90s. And then he scratched up the side of his car, and then he stopped driving at night, and then he only drove to certain destinations, and then he lost his eyesight one evening in one eye, and he eventually realized that that was it for him, no depth perception. And he died within about 8 months of that occurring. When he lost his freedom and his ability to go see who he wanted to see and do what he wanted to do, it appeared to me, anecdotally, that he lost the will to live. It was so central to who he was.
People that have police detectives, where they can monitor when cops are on the streets.
Right.
Is there any correlation in terms of those that, if they're caught, let's say, the frequency of speeding tickets that they would be having on their record, if they actually have and utilize one of those?
I don't know of any of that research. It's a tough thing to do because I'm a prime example. I drove illegally, probably daily, for many, many, many years. And I went many years without being caught. So if you looked at my driving record, which is supposedly objective, but it's not really objective because it's not going to be adjudicated for some time. It may be pled down. It doesn't really indicate my behavior, right? So I would think a lot of the correlations get washed out. I don't know the relationship between radar detectors, but I do know that trying to find data on driving is very difficult because usually all you get is crash data. And that's limited. I don't know whether you were using a cell phone unless we actually go and look at your cell phone records and to see if you were using your cell phone at the moment that you crashed, which is rare. I mean, people just don't usually, and only if there's some kind of challenge, somebody's being sued, do they actually do that.
Could they not look at the purchases of those who would buy radar detectors?
Oh, I don't know how you would track that. I could go buy one right now off Amazon.com and nobody would know. Yes, sir.
You're sort of suggesting that physicians screen for reckless behavior, particularly driving, and that information will eventually get stored in medical records.
Yes.
What are your thoughts about that information being communicated to the communities or shared in any way? Like especially when there's this issue of possible risk taking the environment or hospitality. But as a commissioner, it's kind of your hands are kind of tied.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I would see that more as kind of like the classic Tarasoff duty to warn. Unless you have somebody that's clearly intent on using a vehicle to cause damage, and you know that, I would say that it's privileged information that you as a clinician are working with the patient to mitigate the risks for their own benefits, and that the side product of that is increased safety for everybody. it would be in the medical record, thus it would be discoverable theoretically. But I don't know to whom you would report that information or what you would expect them to do with it, because at that point, unless you wouldn't have any concrete evidence that they were doing anything dangerous. You would just have evidence that they had met criteria for types of behaviors or cognitions or disorders that put them at elevated risk as a driver.
There could be a mechanism where that can be reported, and then it could be handed over to the DMV or authorities to investigate if necessary. I'm just throwing out.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts about that?
Well, I think that would be an interesting approach. I think it would be vigorously resisted by most people in America as an issue of personal freedom. But at the same time, I mean, that gets back to, do we really care about traffic safety? If we really do, then we should collectively work together to take people who are at risk off the road until they can become safe. And if they're willing to do that, that's great. But I don't know that there's a lot of efficacy even for the driver education programs that they use at the teen driver training level. And I don't know that there's a lot of evidence for efficacy of remediation classes when people have been pulled over and have been, most of the times they're offered the option of going to driver education training to mitigate points being added to their license. But I don't know that that actually prevents them from being at risk. And that's when you actually have them in the DMV system. You still can't make them adhere to safe behaving.
I just wanted to give some observations to you since you're very passionate about this. I did EMS for 5 years and did vehicle occupation for the state. One thing that I commonly heard from a lot of state troopers is that they never knew if the exact text message correlated.
Right.
I don't know if like new cell phones or if this is a thing where it'll have a log of the last message and they can't delete it. So like police officer has a wreck, they get the person's cell phone.
Yeah.
Some protected area in the phone or something will have last message was sent at this time.
Right. Well,
What was sent or anything.
Yeah.
At times.
I mean, there is a way to do that clearly. The technology exists to do that. The question is then, does the officer have a right to access your phone? And so it would take a legal intervention that says that in the case of a crash, the officer has the right to access your phone and you must give them your password if it's password protected. That gets over into the kind of like the DUI, right, submitting to a breathalyzer or blood test. A person may still refuse to do it, but now it's a chargeable offense. So you can say, you're involved in a crash, I want to see your cell phone contents, I want to look at your messaging app and see if you were messaging at this time or whether you were on a phone conversation at this time. And if you had a law that allowed you to do that, I mean, you could intimidate your person saying, hey, I need to see that. They may just hand it over. But without legal backing, I don't think you could compel them to do that. And even with legal backing, you may not be able to make everybody do it, but you could then make that as a chargeable offense, which could be admitted probably as evidence and culpability of I guess, responsibility.
I can answer that question.
Oh, good. Thank you.
The information doesn't have to be contained on the phone. The cell provider has a central record of it, and the law enforcement folks can obtain it with a search warrant.
But that does indicate that there's going to be some work on their part.
Right. If you wait too long, if you wait months and months, it gets deleted. But
Yeah.
right away with a search warrant.
And it may be much more powerful in court to have pulled the phone up and say, I see this person hit send, 2 seconds prior to this crash. Or
I think that's the thing, is that I knew they could go and grab it like that, but they had to have real probable cause that was the actual reason.
so it had to satisfy search warrant criteria.
Yeah.
Yeah. Somebody? Yes, sir.
So, yeah, I'm a third-year medical student. I've gone through this entire year
Yeah.
Seeing a ton of patients with attending physicians, residents, and my fellow students. I've not once heard any of those people ask a patient, how did you get here?
Yeah.
We prescribe frequently benzodiazepine jets,
Yeah.
the same effect as alcohol.
Oh, yeah.
Opiates in the works, and I see a very valid point why malpractice should be covered, or that these accidents be covered by malpractice. Has it ever been studied, or would a future study be good, or see if people are asking?
I think a future study, I'm not aware of any studies that have been conducted to see at what frequency, that people in the medical profession are currently just on their own making these inquiries. So that would be great, is to just get a baseline. My guess is it's not occurring per your observations. And then to see if there's some intervention that's simple enough and maybe powerful enough where you bring up potential expanded responsibility for patient behavior outside of the clinic as maybe a reason why you should do this, and then follow up after an intervention to see if it actually makes a dent in patient interactions.
Here's an example of what he's talking about. Under the commercial motor carrier rules from the Department of Transportation, untreated sleep apnea is an absolute bar to holding a commercial driver's
Right.
license. Okay? And yet, people go home all the time after a sleep study where sleep apnea was diagnosed and it's not yet treated.
Right.
You just let them go home.
Right. Yes, yes, yes. That's a
But
fact.
it's not a commercial driver's license.
Mhm.
We don't have any rules.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, though, with sleep apnea, what the sleep apnea experts will say is, don't drive. And then they come to psychiatrists or other physicians, and they say, I can't afford my CPAP machine or my CPAP evaluation even. So I've got to go to work
Right.
to be able to have insurance to be able to, work until then. So you're really stuck between the two. So I think
Yeah.
asking the question has two parameters. One is you're opening up the liability area, which
Right.
is one reason you don't ask it. The second issue is you don't get paid for it.
Right.
And physicians have as much as we're doing here,
Yes.
everything else we're doing. Not saying that's justified.
No, if people do what they're reimbursed for. If you're not reimbursed for it and you've already got a packed agenda for a patient in a very restricted time period, I'm very well aware of the limits of time with physician-patient interaction. And they usually have a presenting problem, and maybe multiple ones, and you're bringing your agenda. And that's usually an add-on, and it's an extravagance. Unfortunately, it's just not a reality.
I also wanted to point out that some of the lack of awareness of people asking about how did you get here in terms of driving has a little bit to do with the structure, the setting of the M3 medical student, because I know in the mental health clinic and in the emergency department at the VA, that question gets asked every day, many times. So
Yeah.
it does. It just probably has to do with your setting.
I wanted to speak about the process for reporting suspected unsafe driving, because I've been involved in 2 cases through the VA. And so there are 4, DPS districts, public safety districts in the state of Tennessee. Each one will have an administrative law judge. And so the way that it works is there's an anonymous number that you call, and I think the person who typically does it at the VA is our information safety officer. For instance, in 2 cases that I ultimately ended up reporting, a new diagnosis of neurocognitive disorder,
Right.
pretty significant impairments, and reports of accidents, tickets, damage, that sort of thing, and they refused to stop driving
Wow.
on a recommendation.
Right. Which made it incumbent upon you to
According to the safety officer, they call anonymously, and that administrative judge will set up a hearing. Sometimes it will be in Nashville, unfortunately. They do it through teleconference.
Mm-hmm.
But she actually is an attorney in the area, the administrative law judge, who will meet with the person that you reported, determine whether or not they find that there's cause for them to be reassessed for the written or the actual driving test, or if anything needs to be done at all.
Nice. That's awesome.
That's that process.
I'm not aware of that, and that should tell you everything right there. That's awesome that y'all are aware of it, and I'm glad that the VA has a mechanism to make that happen. My guess is the general, your general practitioner, family medicine internist or psychologist or just anybody who's out doing kind of one-on-one work may not even be aware that there's a number they could call. And that's something that would probably go right well with an intervention project for future research, is tell people, now that you have a question about somebody's ability to be safe, what do you do if you can't negotiate with them? If they absolutely refuse any responsibility, you could take the next step of making an anonymous report.
Dr. Sharp, in my HIPAA laws, it's kind of a gray area in my mind, but I'd rather err on the side of caution before you violate HIPAA than having them kill a family before and then you become responsible.
Is there a question there?
Yeah.
There's a statement.
Can you report that?
Where am I legally having done that?
I don't know the answer to that. I have to research it. And different states are going to have different rules. generally speaking, if a state has a mandatory reporting circumstance, or if a state has a statute that provides immunity for reporting,
Right.
It's going to trump it.
So that may be something that the legal system might be behind the mechanism to work through that problem.
This is the beauty of the DA. The question is, why do you think the government has so many lawyers?
Hey, thanks everybody. I really appreciate your time and your attention, man. Thank you.